Okay, hello students. This is my last attempt to try this audio track. I messed up the previous two, so hopefully this works. Um, so just to set this up, I have written research myself, scholarly research on popular culture, and the paper I was working on at the time, just to put this in context, was about Lucifer, that TV series you may not have heard of. Ooh, going back, hold on. There we go. And so I was looking at it from two angles as a literary scholar. I was looking at it as a piece of detective fiction, and I was looking at Lucifer as a literary character in the lineage of John Milton's Paradise Lost. If you've ever heard of that, it's a really famous piece of literature. That's all you need to know. This was all about a paper I was writing over that TV show Lucifer. So what I do when I go to look for articles in a paper is I have certain keywords in mind. You'll see the word keywords I've written up there, and I'm starting to write right now. So I have ideas. Keywords are key ideas I'm looking for before I even sit down to go through a piece. I'll get the idea by reading the title. Religious belief in recent detective fiction covers both of my angles, the detective fiction and Lucifer as a character. So I know I'm looking for words like detective, religion, secularization, atheism. So that's kind of what I'm keyed to initially. So you want to have some kind of idea of words or ideas you're looking for before you even start to read. So here we have the abstract. Most scholarly papers start out with an abstract, which is a paragraph. You see I just circled the word secularization. And this paragraph kind of tells you in brief what the whole paper's about. And that's so that other scholars can preview your work and decide if it's right for them. So here we go. Detective fiction emerged as a result of the increasing secularization of society. The certainties expounded by the church are reenacted through the figure of the rational investigator whose perspicacity never fails to uncover the perpetrator and return the world to its prelapsarian tranquility. Big words. You'll see what I do there is I put words that I don't necessarily know. I knew those words, but I'm giving you the example. Put words I don't necessarily know in brackets, and then I go and look them up later. That's a habit I've always had. I've had since I was your age, and I strongly suggest you take up that habit. So I look it up. I see that perspicacity means power of intelligent observation. Prelapsarian means it happened before the fall, so it's referring to the Garden of Eden. So in other words, this complicated sounding sentence is talking about how detectives in fiction kind of function as priests who set the world to rights. They inherit an imperfect world, and their job is to go around bringing us back to a state of grace. Okay, so often the villain whose wicked deeds must be brought to book is the leader of an obscure mystical sect, but otherwise religion, particularly of the mainstream variety, is noticeably absent. This has, however, recently changed. The detective, once the acme of rational thought and deductive flair, incarnated in the figure of Sherlock Holmes, for example, has now been replaced, on occasions, by investigators with overt religious beliefs. The explanation for this apparently inconsistent development is tied to the evolution of crime fiction over recent decades, in which both the model of the traditional hard-boiled detective and the genre itself have been questioned and deconstructed by a new generation of crime writers. So you see we have Sherlock Holmes, who I need to take note of because I should deal with Sherlock Holmes in my paper. We have the idea of investigators with overt religious beliefs, so I know that's what this is going to be about. That's going to help me whenever I go to talk about the TV show Lucifer as a religiously charged detective story. And then I also note and I highlight the evolution of crime fiction. I have a question, which is, what does this evolution entail? That's a question I need to have answered because I don't know what that means when I first start reading. So it's always important to pursue an initial question when you start reading. The first thing that raises a big question for you, you should actually be looking for the answer to that question. Okay, so as I'm noting at the bottom, this is the question of my initial reading. It's not the only question I'm going to have, but it's the question of my initial reading. Okay, so that's it. You see how much annotating I do even just on the first page? That's really the sort of annotating you guys should be doing. So here we go. Here's the real the actual paper. So fictional detectives, particularly those of the hard-boiled kind, not usually express religious convictions. Obvious exceptions include detective stories with a historical setting, such as Ellis Peters' Brother Cadfael series or Umberto Eco's William of Baskerville in The Name of the Rose, in which a non-religious monk would simply be unconvincing. Okay, so I'm kind of taking note of the general idea here. This is the first big idea that's being thrown at us. So usually that's the way it goes in an academic paper. They're trying to give you the best information first, and then they're going to complicate it. So detectives are not typically religious. Okay, taking note of that. Over recent decades, however, both the genre of crime fiction and the tough guy model of fictional detective, which emerged in the United States in the 1920s, have been challenged and deconstructed. Maybe need to know what that means, maybe don't, by a number of crime writers. This process has revealed that the hard-boiled detective, far from being, in Raymond Chandler's words, the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world, is instead plagued by vulnerabilities, failings, and deep-seated prejudices. In other words, he's become as inadequate as the rest of society. This acceptance of the detective's fall from omnipotent self-sufficiency has led, in some cases, to recourse to religious faith, a development which implicitly recognizes the detective's acceptance of his own limitations as agent of redemption. Okay, that's interesting. So you see here, I put the word definition out to the side where I see a term that I think is going to be used a lot, and that's for the term hard-boiled detective. So I want to make sure to note that I have been given a definition of something. So the author's already defined for me how he's going to use the term hard-boiled detective, the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world. Okay, that's part of the definition. And then I also see the logic of the paper. You see my cursive note out to the side where I'd previously taken notes. So I'm going to, over to the left, put this a little differently. So I'm just going to note that this answers my question from the previous page. Okay, so now I know the logic of the paper. This is what he means by the evolution of the detective story, which, remember, was my question. What does that mean? So we have this, in recent years, we have these, we used to have the self-assured, rational detective, then we had the self-doubting, incompetent detective, and now we've moved into religious detective, which is a new form, according to this author, of the self-doubting detective, and he'll unpack that as he goes. So the popularity of the fictional detective in Western literature coincides, argues Carol M. Cusack in Scarlet and Black, non-mainstream religion as other, and detective fiction authors. Okay, so there I have a reference. I want to take note of all these little references he gives me, because those could be new references for me, new sources for me. As organized religion retreated, it became more difficult to believe the theologically charged notion that good and evil do not go unpunished, and that human life is ultimately meaningful, even when random violence threatens to destabilize both individual and communities. That's all from her. So she's trying to show us what secularization means. That's her contribution to this conversation. So Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes is archetypal. I think I skipped a line, but okay. Rational, scientific, calculating, infallible. So that's the previous detective. I'm taking note of that. This is a view shared by Auden, who wrote in his essay, The Guilty Vicarage. Okay, there's another reference for me. That the job of detective is to restore the state of grace in which the aesthetic and the ethical are as one. Okay. And then I notice when I go back and do my rereading, I squiggly line this important bit here. The detective provides the rational replacement for the priest. I will typically do something like that, like make a little squiggly line for something that I think is the major idea that I need to take from the paper. And indeed, I did take that idea from this paper whenever I wrote my paper. So detective as priest. Okay, so back to the Auden quote. In other words, as Brian Diemert comments in the context of Auden's essay, the garden is polluted by the crime of murder and the detective's work is redemptive. Huge idea. It goes along with my previous squiggly line. Detective as priest, detective's work is redemptive. Not that religion completely disappears, as G.K. Chesterton's fictional detective Father Brown. Oops, sorry. I had an alarm going off. Demonstrates, but it is significant that Chesterton, an enthusiastic convert to Catholicism, must make a detective of his priest if he is to be of any earthly use. So I take note of that big idea: all detectives equal priests. And remember, that's according to this author and his sources. Cusack argues that the genre's secular yet conservative nature frequently results in the demonization and punishment of minority religions. This is a view shared by Diemert, who, in reference to cult and sects, so that I'm telling myself, okay, cult and sects is what he means by minority religion, argues that the hard-boiled detective often scorns religious belief and is frequently correct in suspecting those who claim supernatural or divine awareness. Okay. While this may be true, the position of mainstream religion within the genre is left unresolved. That's an important point, so I previously underlined that. And we also see a distinction here. Cults and sects are always bad in detective fiction. Mainstream religion, not so much. It's in this unresolved area in detective fiction. So Christianity would be an unresolved area in detective fiction. This is problematic. It's always important when an author says that. In that the rational detective, with the occasional exception of Father Brown, is assumed to be not merely secular, but in direct opposition, albeit an unarticulated opposition, to the whole notion of religious belief, mainstream or not. Okay, so that's interesting. So there's a genre problem. Mainstream religion is not overtly attacked, which is what they're saying, but the detectives are typically opposed to mainstream religion. So this is an interesting and weird problem for the genre. Yet the genre is deeply conservative. The exegesis of bourgeois, and you see out there I say overstated, question mark. This is, sometimes scholars get a little jargony, and you just have to learn how to deal with it. Yeah, and I've decided I don't know yet. I'm going to make a note. Don't know if I agree that this is a genre problem. It might be a red herring. In other words, it might not be a question for me to pursue or an idea for me to pursue. You want to take note of that too. Maybe I should pursue this. Maybe this is just a red herring. Maybe it's just something that's going to take me off on a wild goose chase. Okay, so the exegesis of bourgeois fantasies of certainty, security, and stability. And such conservatism would normally be expected to provide a privileged place for mainstream Christianity. Okay, that's a good point. Since Christianity is a bourgeois religion, in the West anyway, it's the religion of the suburbs. There is then an absence of mainstream religion in the works of writers such as Hammett, Chandler, MacDonald, and Parker. Okay, so those are all big-time detective fiction writers. And they may well, like Kathy Reichs, the writer used by Cusack to exemplify her thesis, pit their heroes or heroines against insidious sects. Okay, so we have the most popular, the most famous examples of detectives in fiction are not religious, and their enemies are frequently cults. So that's the point that they're making. Indeed, claims Deemer, the manipulative cult, the faked seance, the bogus church, or relatedly the bogus clinic, and the like have become so cliched within the genre that we immediately suspect the tarot reader, crystal gazer, or spiritualistic medium of criminal behavior or worse. Nevertheless, the far more widespread presence of conventional Christianity is largely ignored, despite the enormous possibilities for crime and corruption, jealousy and hatred that a religious setting might offer. And then there's this exception in parentheses. I'm going to go down 3 lines and not bother with that parentheses. And you'll see up there, before I go any further, I'm taking note generally of what I think I can take away from this chunk, which is that Christian churches and clergies would, I think I'm going to say something, would make for good grist or something for a detective genre, or for a detective story. Yeah, good source material, yeah. So here's the change, and I noted out to the side in my original notes. The situation has, however, recently changed. 2 of the best-selling detectives, you want to note whenever an author tells you something's changed. So we have 2 best-selling detectives, Ian Rankin, the Scottish writer, and the American writer James Lee Burke, have created openly Christian detectives who attend church and on occasion discuss their beliefs, while Jack Taylor, the self-destructive protagonist of Ken Bruin's noir novels set in Galway, Ireland, maintains an ambivalent yet ineluctable relationship with his childhood faith. So we've got 3 new examples of detectives who are men of faith in some way, even if they've got a complicated relationship with their faith, or maybe even a negative relation. They're still men with a distinct religion. They're all 3 Christians. So what I want to note here with the star is that at this point in the paper, I've noticed that he's done with his general comments about the genre. From now on, he's going to talk about these specific 3 examples of religious detectives. And that still might have something to offer to my Lucifer paper, so I'm going to keep reading. Because, of course, Lucifer in the TV series, if you haven't seen it, I don't necessarily recommend it. I wrote about it because I thought it was problematic. But Lucifer in the TV series is, of course, supposed to be Lucifer, Not from the, I mean, in a sense from the Bible, more from John Milton's Paradise Lost. And and so, in that sense, in a weird sense, he is a religious detective. He believes there is a God. He, in fact, knows there's a God. Um, so that's what I'm trying to prize out. I'm like, what can I say about Lucifer to try to make sense of him by looking at these other detectives with their own imperfect relationships to their religions? Okay, so that's what I'm going to keep reading. I've got a reason. Okay, so Ian Rankin. So his first Inspector Rebus novel, Noughts and Crosses, was published in 1987. Based in Edinburgh, Rebus is, as Gil Blaine explains, the very model of the hard-boiled detective. We have that term again that I started to define, the hard-boiled detective. Dress him in a trench coat and you would have a very familiar figure, the private investigator as embodied by Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. Except that Rebus, as Blaine fails to notice, is religious. In Noughts and Crosses, its very title makes reference to Christianity. Rebus thinks of church going. We've got this block quote here where Rebus is talking about how he wants to go to church, but he kind of hates going to church at the same time. He wants to have a relationship with God, but he feels it's very deeply personal, and he's not sure that the structure of the church gives that to him. That's basically all he's saying. So Rebus is caught, as Rankin observes, but not only in the nature of his belief. He is also caught or entangled in the conventions of the genre. I think that's important. I could use that observation. As a detective, can he compromise the rationality of his profession by acknowledging allegiance to the irrational? Now, I think that's a loaded term, because faith isn't necessarily irrational. Sometimes it's not merely rational, but it's not irrational. Okay, we'll go to the next page. I'm going to be a little out of sync here, so just bear with me. Colleagues, I don't remember what the thought was, but is not a solution he discovers since his faith requires public expression, and he finds himself trapped and confused, both as a Scottish Christian and as a literary detective. Okay, so I'm continuing on with the Rebus's example. Twice more in Noughts and Crosses, Rebus seeks refuge in the Good News Bible and achieves a kind of solace, becoming at last passive to the will of his malevolent creator. Well, that's loaded. A reference not to God, perhaps, but to Rankin himself, who has embarked on the eccentric course of creating a hard-boiled detective. Rankin, remember who's the author of this Rebus novel, Rankin, or at least the novel's narratorial voice, suggests that Rebus's Christianity is tied to his identity as a Scot, a theme central to the novels, yet uncharacteristically for the sectarian Scots, Rebus refuses to decide between Catholicism and Protestantism. He had nothing against Catholics. The Protestant community might call them left-footers, but Rebus himself kicked a ball with his left foot. He did, however, mistrust the shrine mentality. It made him uneasy. Statues which wept or bled or moved, sudden visions of the Virgin Mary, a face imprinted on a shroud. Despite this aversion for the miraculous, a consequence perhaps of his rationalist professional instincts, he finds himself dropping into a Catholic church in order to confess in the Black Book, simply because it was the first church he came to. Okay, so I'm going to take a general note on all of this, which is that this is all about the particularly complicated relationship of Rebus to his Christianity. So as long as I've got that general idea, all of these little details I'm reading through, I don't really have to hold on to, not for the work I'm doing in my paper. I just need the general thought. Okay, so he goes on and says some stuff about, Rebus is a Protestant, but he's kind of is no big fan of Protestantism. He thinks there's a lot of darkness to it. But he's also, like it's just underlined right there, he also finds himself kind of painted with the Calvinist brush in that he sees people as fundamentally awful and incapable of being good. Certainly this seems to be Rebus's attitude to life and his role as policeman. Forever rebelling against the corrupt and obstructive authorities, he is an individualist unable to play as a team member and operates as a PI within the police force, a situation not uncommon in police detective fiction. I'm going to skip that parenthetical note on 3 lines where I'm doing the note-taking right now. So in Rebus's case, this rebellious individuality is mirrored by his heterodox religious observance. I put that in quotes because I might use that myself in my paper. So heterodox religious observance. Impatient with both Protestant Catholic liturgy, uncomfortable attending church, yet unfulfilled by private worship, his relationship or lack of it with the ecclesiastical authorities serves as a spiritual backdrop to his adversarial position within the Edinburgh police force. His problems are as much metaphysical as professional. That's an important thing to note. That's one way I might describe Lucifer in my paper from the TV show. So I want to note all those things that I think I'll pull out and use. So in Mortal Causes, so we're talking about another Rebus novel now. Father Connor Leary, now something of a friend and mentor of Rebus's, asks him for help on a troublesome housing estate. The roughest scheme in the city, maybe the country. I might run out of time, the paper might turn, so bear with me. There it goes, thought it would. Blah 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 of science and religion, and of policemen and priests, as Rebus himself tacitly confesses when, just before his death in Dead Souls, Father Leary asks Rebus to pray for him. Rebus is unable to accede to the dying priest's wishes. He hadn't the heart to admit he'd stopped praying long ago. So now we're talking about Rebus's loss of faith. Maybe not loss of faith, at least loss of religiosity. But perhaps loss of faith. By the final novel in the series, Exit Music, Rebus's colleague, D.S. Clarke, tells a younger officer that Rebus used to be religious, in that he went to church. Actually, he went to dozens of them, a different one every week. To which the younger man, himself a committed Christian, and it later emerges one of the villains of the story, surmises, looking for something he couldn't find. So I note that I'm going to use this next thing. Rebus's flirtation with religion is not sustained, perhaps is unsustainable. And ultimately, that next little underlined bit, he must go his own way. Okay, so I'm going to think about that when it comes to how I'm going to describe the character of Lucifer in that series. And going down to the next paragraph. Brian Demert's analysis of the Rebus novels, Ian Rankin, The God of the Scots, although concentrating on their religiosity, tends toward the conclusion that they are as much Gothic and Gnostic as Christian. So now we're talking generally about the Scottish people. And at this point, I started reading a little quickly because I'm not sure I need a lot of this for my paper, but you'll see I underlined this bit. The dualities inherent to Gnosticism are also shared by crime novels, with their detectives and villains, while Christianity itself is deeply indebted to Neoplatonist thought. So if you haven't done much reading in philosophy, you might not know what any of that means. Gnosticism was a very popular, call it like philosophical, quasi-religious movement in the Greco-Roman world that saw the universe divided evenly into two parts, good and evil. And that's what it means. So when it says the dualities, that's the duality it's talking about. Everything's divided into good and evil, light and dark. So the dualities inherent to Gnosticism are also shared by crime novels, okay? Because true, crime novels are Gnostic in that sense. They're good guys, they're bad guys. There's detectives and villains. And Christianity is indebted to Neoplatonist thought. That little thought out to the side means that there's a tiny bit of Gnosticism in Christianity too. We don't believe the universe is evenly divided between good and evil. We believe that the universe was made fundamentally good and that God is fundamentally good. But we do believe that evil is an element in our experience. So I guess they're just pointing out the fact that there's an affinity between Christianity and the detective novel, and maybe this is one of those areas of richness that need to be explored more by writers. And one reason why Christianity is actually well suited for the detective novel. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've gone down to the bottom here and I've made a little star beside Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I think it's that I'm summarizing this chunk that came after that long underlined part that I just got through talking about. Really, this is just about Rebus's process of personal secularization. In other words, this is about his process of becoming a less and less religious person. So in the next paragraph, we're continuing on just a bit longer, but what he's going to start doing is comparing Rebus to Marlowe. So Philip Marlowe was the most famous detective in all of fiction for the longest time. If you haven't read the Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe books, you're missing a treat. They're canon. They're considered classics in detective genre. But here I'm going to note, here's the huge point. Rankin, I believe Rankin to be consciously using religion to interrogate the contradictions, weaknesses, and inconsistencies in the hard-boiled model that the contemporary detective novel has revealed. by blatantly forcing Rebus to examine himself through the filter of Christianity, a round peg in a square hole, ranking questions not only the shortcomings of Scottish Calvinism, but also the redemptive powers of the traditional literary detective. I can actually use all of that, because almost all of that can be said with variation about Lucifer, so that's good for my paper. So as I said, now we're into this Rebus comparison to Philip Marlowe. This is important to point out because every decent paper is constantly engaged in comparing and contrasting, but comparison generally. And here, when you're doing literary writing, not that this will pertain to all of you, but when you're doing literary scholarly writing, you're really just comparing previous examples of things to current examples of things to raise questions about the current examples, and sometimes to raise question about the previous examples, which is what this author's doing here. He's comparing Rebus to Philip Marlowe and saying, look, Philip Marlowe was this kind of like, fists first, kind of tough guy detective who was a misogynist. He was hard drinking. He went it alone. He was kind of this old model of what we now call toxic masculinity. And they're saying Rebus, because he's religious, avoids kind of the worst failings of toxic masculinity because his religion allows him to question his own self-sufficiency. When we're religious, we admit our brokenness and we admit our need for others and our need for God. And so that's basically the point that this author's making here. You'll notice I've done some underlining with ideas I think I can kind of repurpose for my paper. The church or chapel or Bible are part of Rebus's recognition of his failings. Okay, so like I was just saying. But yeah, I wanted to note out to the side, you see my previous note, it said, more importantly, a novel in which a protagonist endowed with Rebus's cynical character converts wholeheartedly to Christianity would be absurd and quite possibly spell the end of its author's literary career for its very incongruity. So saying you can't have an overly cynical character who converts to religion because that's just not the way it goes. Overly cynical people tend not to do those things, and so it comes off as unrealistic often when you're trying to write it. But here in a nutshell, I've got the author's whole thought about Rebus. This is where he kind of ends his discussion of the Rebus character. So, Rebus's flirtation with religion is then, I believe, one of Rankin's techniques for undermining the conventional self-sufficiency and omnipotence of the fictional detective, as well as providing a useful context for his explorations of Gnosticism and the Gothic, both in the detective fiction genre and in the city of Edinburgh. Okay, so I want to hold on to Gnosticism as an idea to bat around in my own paper. That will be important. So now we moved on to the American author James Lee Burke and his character Dave Robichaux. And the discussion here, so you know, out to the side, you see in cursive handwriting, I've written Robichaux as exemplar, just to note for myself that we're no longer talking about Rebus. Moved on to the second character. But really the conversation here is just about how Robichaux is an uncomplicated Christian character. He's Catholic. He doesn't have any deep-seated doubts about his Catholicism the way Rebus has his doubts about his Christianity, his Protestantism. But I do like the idea as much political and social as religious. So even though Robichaux is more unproblematically religious than Rebus, the author uses his religion more to make social and political points. So that's something to keep in mind. When I'm looking at Lucifer, the TV series, and I'm examining it for the things I think are wrong with it, am I taking stock of like the political and social connotations of what's going on in it? So good, I want to keep track of that. So I got something out of it. So we got this page where they're talking about some of Robichaux's cases and some of the religious people he's come across. Their sister Molly. And they're building on this idea that Robichaux, even though he's unproblematically religious, it's mostly really about society and politics, not so much about religion for him. And so it's talking about how the religious characters he encounters, who he admires the most, are mostly social activists. It's not that he admires them, and that's okay, they're not saying that's wrong, but it's not that he admires them because of their religiosity. He actually admires them because of their social activism. And so they're pointing out, even though Robichaux has this uncomplicated relationship to his Christianity, it's still, he might have a very superficial relationship to his Christianity. And that's yet another way to approach religion as a detective fiction author, they're saying. Okay, because remember, all these detectives, formerly Rebus and now Robichaud, um, the purpose of them, the purpose of writing them the way these authors are doing, is to deal with this issue of secularization, the fact that we're not a default religious society anymore. So how does that cash out in a detective who's supposed to be putting society to rights? The detective who used to be another form of the priest, right? Okay, so I didn't have a lot on that previous page, just some thoughts and maybe a little underline. But on this page, we say, unlike Rankin, Burke. So see, what I like about this is, and not enough of you do this in young writers, just tend not to, young scholars, but in a good scholarly paper, you don't just drop something. So, he previously talked about the author Rankin and his character Rebus. Well, he didn't just stop talking about Rankin. You'll see him bring Rankin up again and again. So he's keeping his paper in conversation with itself. He's treating the paper like an organic conversation. So you don't just bring something up and then drop it and move on to the next thing. You keep, so with Burke, he's now going to compare Burke to Rankin. He's going to compare the character of Robichaud to Rankin's character of Rebus. And that's excellent. That's excellent writing. Okay, that's excellent scholarly writing, I should say. Okay, so unlike Rankin, Burke is able, within the context of modern American society, to create and sustain a hero who is both rebellious and devout, and who, although somewhat sentimental and melodramatic, is neither inconsistent nor intellectually dishonest. Perhaps this may be partly explained away by the difference between an inflexible and unforgiving Calvinism on the one hand, and an accommodating and worldly Catholicism on the other. It certainly seems to represent a difference in how religion is perceived on either side of the Atlantic. I think that's super important for my paper on Lucifer. Because I remember I'm going to look at that character both through a Protestant lens and Catholic lens, because Lucifer as a fictional character belongs to both worlds. Robichaud, although unquestionably Catholic, is, as we have seen, religious on his own terms. That's that social and political religious. He is happy to leave the finer points of doctrine to others. For him, it is the people he chooses to share his worship with, and the good deeds, rather than the fine words of practicing Christians such as Molly, that he values most. He is also, if necessary, prepared to abandon, at least temporarily, Christian ideas, such as the turning of the other cheek, if this should prove expedient. He reflects, therefore, in the words of Grail and Davidman, the tendency of the people in contemporary American society to pick and choose what they will and will not practice and believe within a religious tradition. Okay, so I note out to the side that's very pragmatic, and maybe I want to recycle that thought. Yeah, and then I just note generally down here that he's tying the character to the culture, right? This scholar is Bill Phillips. He's tying the character of Robichaud to the American culture of James Lee Burke. So that's just to make an important point, which is that an author is always writing from his own or her own culture and will be informed by that culture. Maybe I want to think about that as I'm watching Lucifer. Why do we have this stupid, cheesy, theologically idiotic show about a detective who is essentially the character from John Milton's Paradise Lost? Well, then I want to look at American consumer culture and look at the superficiality of American consumer culture and all this other stuff. So those are the kind of thoughts I'm having as I'm reading through this, and I'm reflecting on the paper I'm writing, right? Because that's the point. I don't want to get so lost in the paper I'm reading right now that I forget that I'm doing this to write my own paper. So I draw a little line and I notice, okay, now we're talking about the third detective character, Jack Taylor. So we've moved on to the third and final detective character. And there are only a couple pages left, so bear with me. So Jack Taylor is an Irish private investigator, essentially is what he is. And he's got a really, he probably has the most complicated relationship to religion. So there's certain things I've underlined in my previous notes. He has his inability to solve cases is sometimes something that applies to Taylor, but that was actually a general remark about this kind of new wave of detectives who are reflecting the uncertainty of the modern era. So unlike Sherlock Holmes, who could solve all the cases with his reason, because that was back when we believed, a man and his reason is all you needed to conquer the world, yay! And then World War I and World War II happened, and all of a sudden we doubted the ability of reason to solve all our problems. And so a character like Sherlock Holmes stopped working for us. And so we get detectives, kind of bumbling detectives, screw-up detectives, um, detectives who sometimes can't even solve their cases, and that reflects more of the uncertainty we felt as a society. So they're tying all of that to this character of Taylor and how he's written. So it says Taylor's relationship with God and Catholicism is ambivalent, often contradictory, and frequently confrontational. I want to take that idea because I might be able to use that for Lucifer. I might even note that Taylor might be a Luciferian character whenever I'm thinking about previous detective characters in my writing of my paper. Okay. And I want to note down here, you see where I just made the writing on the side to the right, that there's a whole lot of commentary on the church here. So that lets me know that the Jack Taylor novels, the character Jack Taylor novels, are mostly commentaries on the church. It's an Irish Catholic writer trying to come to grips with the Irish Catholic Church, which was mired in scandals, and he's doing it in part through this detective. Right. So again, that causes me to reflect on Lucifer. What is the American writer of Lucifer trying to comment on in our society? Okay, and I like this idea. Taylor's faith is not then either intellectual or even particularly spiritual. It is ascriptional. That means it's something he aspires to. Or I'm not something he aspires to, something that was ascribed to him, a result of habit and upbringing. Okay, that's a big point, so I want to note again. So Taylor's relationship with his religion is one of conscious helplessness. He can't help but be Catholic. He was raised in an almost militant Catholic milieu. He is Catholic for better or worse for the rest of his life. He's just stuck in those thought forms and those habits of being. So he'll cross himself whenever a city bus takes off that he's riding. It'll be unconscious, those sorts of things. So I want to think to myself, well, that's actually quite a lot in common with the character of Lucifer, the one I'm writing about. And so again, I have another reason to draw a connection between the two and maybe consider Jack Taylor a Luciferian character. And then here he brings Taylor into conversation with Robichaux, who was the previous detective he was writing about. Again, he's keeping his paper in conversation with itself as he goes, with constant comparisons to things he had previously brought up. It's very smart writing. Okay, second to last page. So I like this first underlined bit from my previous notes where you see the black underline. Bruin, that's the Jack Taylor writer, and Burke, that's the Robichaux writer. Their novels also include the devil as an antagonist. So the devil actually appears in their novels. Virtually all of Burke's books insist on the evil nature of criminals, particularly those who become the object of Robichaux's investigations. And they note that this is also true of Burke's novels about Texas attorney Billy Bob Holland. Typical are the villains of Burke's 2010 novel, The Glass Rainbow, on whose evil Robichaux briefly, if dismissively, ponders. So I didn't care to dwell on the psychological complexities of evil men. Whether their kind possess the wing spread of a Lucifer or a moth is a question better left to theologians. Evil, then, is taken for granted as existing, and neither the sociological nor the theological implications merit analysis. So I'm just going to take a general note on all of this, that this is about the place of evil in the novels. Okay, so for Robichaux, it's definitely there, but he doesn't bother to reflect on it, as I just read for you. For Taylor, it's a very humanized idea. So there's a devil. In fact, in one of the Jack Taylor novels, it talks about this below in that long paragraph that we're still in. In one of the Taylor novels, there is an actual character who might be Satan. But over time, the Taylor novels become very, very humanistic. In fact, they kind of drop the idea of a devil. But at the end here, I make this note. So for Rankin, this would be intellectually dishonest. Oh, I'm sorry. So see, again, he's comparing Rankin to Bruin, this other author. So again, comparisons. So Rankin... I won't go into the details on that because that'll throw you off. But I just want to point out for your benefit that he's consistently bringing previous parts of this paper he had written into conversation with current parts. Okay, love that. So we have the big point down here about all of these. So he's making kind of big summary point about all of these authors he's discussed, from the classic authors, Hammett, Chandler, and Spillane, to the present. So these past authors were sexist, racist, homophobic, alcoholic, etc., right? So now he's comparing these three new authors to these old authors. So that's another layer of comparison, which is excellent. So he's showing us the evolution. Remember that initial question I had? What in the world does the evolution of the detective genre mean? That's what he was addressing there. This is what I mean. We have these new kind of detective novels with these new kind of detective characters who are religious and yet full of self-doubt. And this is how they differ from the old detectives who are like hard-boiled and full of their own confidence in their reason, but also, hard-drinking, broken kind of people who would nevertheless succeed in the face of their brokenness. But yeah, so that the big point I want to make about this top paragraph up here is that the genre follows the discoveries of the culture, right? So our culture has discovered that women aren't helpless idiots, and so we don't depict women as helpless idiots anymore in detective fiction. We've discovered that alcoholics are not brave souls, fighting the world with the power of their individuality. They're broken people with a disease, right? So as we've discovered these things as a culture, our detective fiction reflects these changes, right? So that's the big point. So I got this underlined portion. So these new writers, the more recent detective writers, depict a detective no longer sure of him or herself, vulnerable, often the victims of violence, and frequently unable to resolve their cases satisfactorily. And then I have this other bit here that I've just underlined that I think is super important. But just as the detective stories of the early 20th century responded to a loss of religious faith by substituting God, Jesus, or the priesthood for a temporal redemptive equivalent, that's the detective, contemporary readers and writers have in turn lost faith in the upright, omniscient investigator. Okay, they're saying now we've lost faith because it's harder for us to believe in God as a society. It's also harder for readers to believe in a perfect, upright, omniscient investigator. We need our investigators, our detectives, to be broken human people struggling against a lot of uncertainty and a lot of darkness. Okay. So here's where I note out to the side, here's the author's kind of summative judgment that these new detectives represent a step forward. They're actually better than the classic detectives that he had previously discussed, those hard-boiled detectives. So good, I found the author's judgment, and it's right there toward the end. Now we have this little bit of a conclusion, and this is just a summary statement of where he's gone with this thought, where he's taken us through his description of this evolution of the detective novel. Okay, so, and I like this bit, I might reuse it. So, the fictional detective turns to the church without even really knowing why. Okay, that's maybe the most important thing I can take from my paper on the TV show Lucifer, about a Luciferian detective. Okay, so that gives you hopefully some sense of how I work my way, like how I engage my mind whenever I'm reading through an article. And then and I really make those reference notes, borrow any kind of note taking that you see from me. You guys will do fine.